This is the reason why Pakistan, Laos, Sri Lanka, among many others, are all suddenly going bankrupt. We first need to understand the main driving force that was driving their staggering economic and population growth over the last 50 years or so, and that was globalization. According to geopolitical expert Peter Zion, globalization was a side effect of America's foreign policy aim of Soviet containment during the Cold War to de-incentivize third world countries, meaning countries outside the American or Soviet spheres of influence, from falling into communism. America used its overwhelming naval superiority to keep the oceans and thus trade routes safe from pirates and other antagonistic countries like the Soviet Union. Along with favourable loans from the IMF, this ushered in a golden period of globalization where underdeveloped countries could rapidly industrialize thanks to American loans and American companies, which now felt safe in investing in expensive factories in the third world countries to tap into their cheap labour, for they knew they would be protected by the American Navy and American interventionism. These developing countries, often with few natural resources and poor agricultural yields, could now buy cheap fuel and grain on the international market, leading to booming populations, and this led to an unprecedented period of global peace and prosperity. These countries like Pakistan, Laos and Sri Lanka had huge economic booms as they could freely use the newly safe oceans, investors in cheap energy and food to fuel their economic and population booms. It was a win-win-win for all except for those in the Soviet Empire. However, since the end of the Cold War, questions have been asked to whether this policy that began as a means of Soviet containment was actually good for America and the West. For the workers of the Western world looked at the growing prosperity of those in developing countries and the booming wealth of Western business tycoons while seeing the collapse of working class factory jobs in the West, and they began to think, what was in it for us? Globalization seemed like a pretty bad deal. And furthermore, America was noticing how the globalization it fostered had directly resulted with the rise of new geopolitical rivals, especially China, and the capitalist class were noticing how the aging and shrinking populations of these previously poor countries were making them less viable as cheap labor sources. And all of this would culminate to the last few years where we saw anti-globalist popularist politicians in America like Trump on the right and Sanders on the left, the trade war between the West and China, the COVID pandemic which made everyone wake up to the fragility of international trade, and the nail in the coffin for the globalization golden age was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for we need to remember that Russia and Ukraine exported over a third of the world's wheat supply and about 15% of energy. Suddenly the world and the economic systems that made Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Laos possible were cut. The cheap energy and food that these countries relied on for their huge populations were gone, and so was the political will in Europe and America that supported this system. And thus, all at once, these developing countries are starting to collapse.